Hi, class. Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at four volume, four variance analysis. And so I'm going to share my screen with you. All right, today we're going to be looking at overhead variances, and we're going to be using four variance analysis. We're going to be the Osterman Incorporated, and we're using a standard costing system, and we are going to develop its overhead rates from the current annual budget. The budget is based on an expected annual output of 120,000 units that requires 480,000 direct labor hours. That's what we budgeted. Then they've thrown in here practical capacity is 500,000 hours. You really don't need this in this particular problem, but what practical capacity is the normal operating capacity. It's the maximum amount that you think that your company can operate at efficiently. But you don't need this practical capacity here. It's just added information. What you do need to know is what the annual budgeted overhead costs are, and it tells you the total cost, of which 556,800 is fixed overhead. What you're going to have to do in this problem is break your overhead down into variable overhead and fixed overhead. Since they gave you the fixed overhead and they gave you the total overhead, you'll subtract the fixed overhead from the total overhead to get your variable overhead. So you should break your budget down, your overhead budget, into variable and fixed components. This is your fixed amount. You'll have to find the variable amount. There's a total of 119,400 units using 478,000 direct labor hours that were produced during the year. These are actual units produced, and the hours were actual at 478,000. What I found that helped me with this problem is to kind of make up a budget and put down a column for your budgeted amounts and put down a column for your actual amounts. And then you can use these in these formulas to help you with these variances. The actual variable overhead costs for the year were 230,600, and the actual fixed cost were 556,250. So this time they gave you the actual variable and the actual fixed cost. And if you combine both of these together, that would give you the total actual overhead. So if you make up a spreadsheet and you list your budgeted amounts and you compare them to your actual amounts, you might be able to see a little bit better about where these formulas are coming from. In a four variance analysis, what we're going to be looking at are four variances. For our overhead, since we're breaking them down into fixed and variable components, your fixed components are going to have two analyses, and your variable components will have two analyses. Or your fixed components will have two variance analyses, and your variable components will have two variance analyses. You need to know the formulas. So what I've done is I've highlighted here where we have actually determined the variance. The first variance we're going to look at is the fixed overhead spending variance. This is the formula that you need to know to be able to get your fixed overhead spending variance. We're going to take our actual fixed overhead and we're going to compare it to our budgeted fixed overhead. So both of these were given. You'll remember your actual fixed overhead was right here at 556,250. Your budgeted fixed overhead was 556,800. Both of these amounts were given. So you just subtract the the budget amount from the actual amount. And because the actual amount was less than the budgeted amount, we have a favorable variance. So on the fixed overhead spending variance, you're simply going to take your actual fixed overhead, subtract your budgeted fixed overhead from it, and that will give you the fixed overhead spending variance. All of your variances I've highlighted for you to make it a little bit easier to understand. The next item that they wanted you to calculate was the volume variance. And before we can calculate the volume variance, I'm going to scroll down here so you can see down here, this is where the actual volume variance is calculated. You have to figure out some information because you're going to need to know what your budgeted fixed overhead is, which happens to be given to you, but your applied fixed overhead is not given to you. So you're going to need to know how to determine your applied fixed overhead. And right here is where they're showing you the formula to determine your applied fixed overhead. You're going to need to know your standard fixed overhead rate, which this problem did not give you. You're going to need to know your standard hours, which were also not given, before you can find your fixed overhead rate. So what we need to work on is we need to know how to determine our standard fixed overhead rate. And so I've done that in this first calculation. What we did know was that the budgeted fixed overhead was 556,800. That was given. What we did know was that our budgeted hours were 480,000. That was given. If you divide 480,000 hours into your budgeted fixed overhead, it will give you $1.16, which is our standard fixed overhead rate. So the first thing you need to do is you need to figure out what your standard fixed overhead rate is. And this is the formula for calculating your standard fixed overhead rate. It's the budgeted fixed overhead divided by your budgeted hours. Also, what you need to know how to do before you can get your applied fixed overhead is you need to know what your standard hours are. Before you can determine your standard hours, you need to know the time it takes to produce 1 unit. And so we'll have to figure out the time it takes to produce 1 unit. So I've done that right here. The time it takes to produce 1 unit is found by taking your budgeted hours, which was given, and dividing it by the budgeted units, which was given. If you divide 120 into 480, it'll tell you that the time that it takes to produce 1 unit is 4 hours. Now I've taken this a step further, and you really didn't have to do this part here because you need to know that it takes 4 hours to determine your standard hours. You need to know the time it takes to produce 1 unit, which is 4 hours. Again, I got that by dividing 120,000 units that we were anticipating, that we budgeted for, into the budgeted amount of the hours, the budget hours. So 120,000 units divided by the budget hours gives you 4 hours per unit. That's the time it takes to produce 1 unit. We need to multiply that by the actual units produced, which was a given amount. When you multiply that, that will give you the standard hours. So the standard hours would be fed into determining your applied fixed overhead. You need to know your rate. You need to know your standard hours. Multiply your standard fixed overhead rate by your standard hours, and that will give you the applied fixed overhead. And then we substitute that into this formula here. So the budgeted fixed overhead was given. The applied fixed overhead, you had to find. The difference between these is the fixed overhead volume variance. And the fixed overhead volume variance is unfavorable because the budgeted amount was the applied fixed overhead was less than the budgeted amount. That's why this is unfavorable. So when we talk about a volume variance, we're usually talking about the units produced. So what this means is, since it's unfavorable, is that we produce less than what we originally had anticipated. So remember, when you're doing 4 variance analysis, you'll break your fixed cost and your variable cost down from your total overhead. Your fixed cost will get 2 variances. Those are the ones that I just went over. And your variable overhead will get the other 2 variances, making up 4 variance analysis. In part 2, they want you to compute the variable overhead spending and efficiency variances. So what you need to know in order to determine the variable overhead spending variance is you need to know what the actual variable overhead rate is. They did not give you that in this problem. You have to find the actual variable overhead rate. And to find the actual variable overhead rate, we take our actual variable overhead cost, which they did give us, and we divide it by the actual direct labor hours, which was also given. Make sure in your calculations that you do not round this out, because it will mess up this unfavorable variance if you rounded this back to 48 cents. So leave it in your calculator when you're calculating these rates to get the closest amount of the variable overhead spending variance. So again, find your actual variable overhead rate. You have to determine that in this problem. It was not given. Then you're going to have to also determine your standard variable overhead rate. It was not given. The standard variable overhead rate is based on budgeted amounts. Your budgeted variable overhead cost, we had to determine that. The total overhead cost were $787,200. They gave us our fixed overhead cost. So if you subtract those, it'll leave you with the variable overhead cost. Once you have your variable overhead cost, you're going to divide it by your budgeted hours, and that gives you a rounded off 48 cent, an even 48 cent. The difference between these two is the variance, because the actual variance was more than the standard, because the actual rate, actual variable overhead rate was more than your standard variable overhead rate. There was an unfavorable variance. And when you subtract these, this is what you get as the unfavorable variance amount. Then we need to multiply that by the actual hours, and that gives us the variable overhead spending variance, which was $1,160. Then you can move on and calculate the variable overhead efficiency variance. You need to know what your actual hours are, and that 478,000 actual hours was a given amount. So you didn't have to find this, this was given. But you do have to find the standard hours. Remember, to find the standard hours is the time it takes to produce one unit, which is 4 hours, times the actual units produced, which were 119,400. This amount was given, but remember earlier we had to find out how much time it took to produce one unit, and it was 4 hours. When you multiply these, that gives you the standard hours. The standard hours would be subtracted from the actual hours, and because the actual hours were more than the standard hours or the budgeted hours, this variance here becomes unfavorable. We're going to multiply it by the standard variable overhead rate, which we found up above here, which was 48 cents. 400 times 48 cents gives you $192, which is unfavorable. So this is for variance analysis. And you need to learn these formulas here. And the variance analysis is highlighted. The rest of these formulas are just needed to be able to calculate the actual variances. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.